Thanks so much for having me. It's really great to be here, and this is a special event in bringing together so many organizations and individuals that are making so much progress on research transparency. And I really did enjoy the first panel, just hearing all the overlapping interests, and I really am confident that this meeting will foster a lot of collaboration. We have so much in common, so many common interests and activities, so it's just wonderful to be here. I'm going to speak, I guess, for about half an hour or so on some new stuff that's going on in open science, on reproducibility in economics, and also bring in some developments in other fields too. I want to start by kind of linking what I'll be talking about today to a new book that just came out that I wrote with co-authors Garrett Christensen, who's here, who's at the U.S. Census Bureau, and Jeremy Fries at Stanford Sociology. It's a textbook on a lot of the topics we've been talking about, how to do transparent and social science research. We benefited a lot from all the years of training courses and materials that BITS put together. It's also based on a course that Garrett and I taught at Berkeley a few years ago that Elliot attended. I'm looking around the room at folks who have been part of this for a while. We actually have copies. Here's a copy of the book. We actually have 15 copies, not 5, because we found a box that had been lost. That's the box right over there. So if you send an email right now to my email address, I will give you a signed or unsigned. Garrett and I can both sign or unsign the copy of the book at the end of the talk today. You have one already? Hey, great. Okay, great. That's my plant in the crowd. She's generating enthusiasm. Thanks, Mary Say, for doing that. But anyway, send me an email, and we'll definitely want to distribute the book as far and wide as possible, and we hope it can be useful for instruction. It's designed really for a kind of graduate training course, graduate class level, or advanced undergrad level. I honestly think it'd be very good for RAs. So for all the people here who are talking about training RAs and having research teams, it's meant to be a pretty self-contained guide to a lot of the major topics in the field, and you can see some of them here. These are basically the chapters in the book. So these will look pretty familiar for folks just in terms of the conversations we've been having. A lot of discussion on registration, pre-analysis plans, reproducible coding, ethical research, as well as a whole kind of front end of the book really documenting a bunch of the problems in social science research, publication bias, specification searching. So anyway, hopefully it's useful. There's also related online lectures that BITS has put out in a MOOC through FutureLearn, and then the BITS site just has a lot of material. So definitely, take advantage of that. So anyway, that's just a little plug, and some of what I'll be covering today will relate directly to the book. Some of it's new stuff that kind of has come out just in the last few months, even since the book came out. Okay, so I think for this audience, I probably don't need to motivate why we're interested in research transparency as much as I would maybe for a more general audience, but needless to say, being able to verify that your results can be reproduced, being able to verify where they come from, or letting other researchers understand where they come from is really important for the credibility of your research. That's really the fundamental starting point. In terms of economics in particular, I personally see the move towards research transparency in open science as really a natural next step in the move towards credible research. We can go back to Lemur's work and Card and Kruger and Angersten, Pischke, and so many others, along the way. These are just some of the famous kind of milestones in having more convincing research. I started graduate school in 1996, and there was no open data and data sharing, and there were no experiments, really just the first couple experiments. I was lucky enough to get involved in some of the early experiments in Kenya in 95, 96, 97. Even teaching quasi-experimental methods and research based on natural experiments like the Card and Kruger minimum wage work was so controversial at the time that we would actually have research design. So just with a little bit of perspective, the field has come really far in the last 20-something years, but we can do a lot better. So, this is the continuation of that very positive trend. Beyond the value in terms of boosting the credibility of our work, research transparency and open science really do resonate with core values of the whole scientific enterprise. And here I cite the Robert Merton kind of famous 1942 article where he lays out what are the key elements of the scientific ethos. And if you read that work, and again, we cover that, where there's a chapter on this in the textbook, you'll see that open science values are central to what science is about. The ability to, verify and replicate results are central. Being open to criticism, being, open to being transparent are really central to what science is all about. So I think it's something that a lot of us can really get behind in a more normative sense, beyond just the direct benefits for credible research. Okay, so what I'm not going to spend too much time on again here today is really just documenting the problems in social science research or economics research. I think people are aware of the limitations of our bodies of evidence. There have been numerous instances of fraud in certain fields. I think in social psychology in the last decade, just like many famous cases of fraud where famous scholars basically, internationally were brought down because of fraud. There's well-known instances of publication bias, and in fact, there's research that really spans disciplines documenting how widespread publication bias is. There are famous papers showing that almost no null results traditionally were published. So if you look at journals, everything was significant. So every null hypothesis was rejected basically, or 90-something% of them were. There's some actually very good work. I should have put the citation up here. In Econ, there's a forthcoming paper in the AER by Isaiah Andrews and Max Casey, which is, I think, some of the best recent work on documenting publication bias in Econ in particular. And their bottom line, looking at both experimental work and observational work, is if you compare the likelihood a result is published, if it's a null result versus a statistically significant result with a p-value less than 0.05, their claim is the significant result is somewhere between 3 times to 30 times more likely to be published in Econ. And these are between like 2011 and 2015. So this isn't like decades ago. That's kind of the current state of affairs, that probably a lot of null results are still disappearing. They never get published. They never get written up. We never see them. So one of the things I took away from this excellent, paper, the Andrews and Casey paper, is that, anything we can do to see more null results is probably really good for research, because we're going to get a much better sense of what the distribution of treatment effects are if we can see a lot of these null results instead of only seeing the significant results. So that's publication bias. And then we had a lot of discussion this morning, really great discussion from, the various organizations about replication failures, reproducibility, how important it is to make sure we, at a minimum, have computational reproducibility, if not broader robustness. So, I think there's a lot of issues to work on here. What I don't want to do, though, is really focus on the problems. What I really see now in terms of the whole kind of meta research and open science field is we've spent the last, 5-7 years documenting problems. There's a lot more awareness of problems than there was 6 or 7 years ago when organizations like BITS were getting started. Center for Open Science. When the transparency initiatives in JPAL and others were getting going, there's a lot more awareness. I think the frontier now is really understanding how we can intervene to improve the scientific process. What kinds of interventions and programs and policies could lead to better outcomes. And actually, that should be sort of where we want to go. And again, a lot of the discussion about what big organizations like the World Bank and others can do to improve the research process are sort of in this theme, or JPAL or SIGA or others, 3IE. Okay, so three main themes. And again, I'm just going to touch on each of them a few minutes each, and then hopefully we can have some open discussion. I want to talk about journal practices and how influential they appear to me. Talk about some cases there. Katie alluded to one of them. I'm going to talk about the rise of study registration and pre-results review. Kiesler alluded to some of this. I'm going to talk about this in a little more detail as well. And then I'm going to present some new unpublished data from a new working paper that I have with co-authors, including Garrett and others, on trends in open science attitudes and practices. So just some new survey data that we collected. So all of this is just meant to kind of hopefully bring some new frontier ideas out and start an interesting conversation that goes beyond just lamenting the problems in our field or in our fields more broadly. There are many problems. We know what some of them are, but we want to move forward and make progress. That's going to be a bit of the goal of the discussion. Okay, number one, journal editorial practices are influential. Anybody who works as a researcher knows why they're influential. People want to publish. So what journals mandate and journals require and ask become very important for the decision-making of scholars. And if we are going to move sustainably to a new research culture, a new, more open science-friendly, research transparency-friendly research culture, journal policies could play a very important role as a kind of lever in moving cultural change, moving towards new norms. So let me talk about one particular case that I think is really, really neat. And this is actually some research that BITS had funded. Abel Brodeur, so Brodeur and Blanco Perez wrote a piece, which is forthcoming now in Economic Journal, where they study a really interesting natural experiment. The natural experiment was, a few years ago, a bunch of leading health economics journals, and you would know some of these, Journal of Health Economics and several others. The editors got together and wanted to do something to promote research transparency, and in particular, they wanted to deal with issues of publication bias. So they were very aware of these issues of like null results not getting published, which is really one of the leading concerns in the research transparency space. And they issued an editorial statement stating that, it doesn't really matter if you get a null result or significant results for our journals. What matters is good quality research. So they put out that editorial statement. Beyond that, every time a referee request was sent to a scholar saying, okay, referee this paper, review this paper, there was a statement reiterating the same point, saying it doesn't matter if there's a null result or not. Just go ahead and judge this paper on the merits, and we'll publish it based on the merits. We're not obsessed with the p-value. So, again, you can see a bit of the quote there. This is a neat case where, like, a nudge, a kind of signal that editors have a certain view or, a certain attitude could affect reviewer behavior. What Blanco Perez and Brodeur did is they pre-registered. This is an observational study. They're taking advantage of a natural experiment, not an RCT. They registered on OSF, the Open Science Framework, a pre-analysis plan of how they were going to analyze this data. They have these 8 treatment journals where the editors put out this statement. They identified 2 comparison journals. It was Journal of Public Economics and Labor Economics. So very good applied micro journals that publish papers pretty similar to the health econ papers you would see in these 8 journals. And they said, those are going to be our comparison journals, and we're going to run a difference in difference analysis looking at the publication of null results in our treatment journals and the control journals. Again, pre-specified. And they wanted to see if this attempt to change culture worked. What did they find? They found a large increase within the first year after the editorial statement was put out and the referee kind of, letters to referees were put out, a big increase in the publication of null results in these journals by about 18 percentage points. So let me show you the data. So this is the diff and diff plot. The light gray are those control journals in public economics and labor economics. And you can see in general, 50 to 55% of articles published in those journals here had significant results. Here the y-axis is, p-value less than 0.05 for the main tests, sort of the main outcomes in the paper. Before the change, to the left of the blue line, in the treated journals, the dark gray line with the T, they also had 50%, something like that, significant results. They look pretty similar. But once the editorial statement comes out and the instructions for referees, the proportion of significant results falls sharply in the treated journals. Now, this isn't the perfect experiment. I don't know. Are there pre-trends? I don't know. There's only a couple years of data. There's only a couple, 2 journals here, 8 journals here. So this isn't the ideal research design, but they did pre-specify it. And it's pretty suggestive. It's pretty suggestive that journal policies can be influential. So this is just to say that for anybody who is involved in editing a journal, working on a journal, think about editorial statements like this as being potentially useful in nudging the research community to accept null results and maybe nudging our culture in the direction of not rejecting null results out of hand. Okay, so I found this to be quite a provocative result. It's new data. It's forthcoming. In my own mind, as I look around at econ journals, the journal I would most love to be innovative in this way is AER Insights. So if people know, there's this new journal that's come out through the AEA which is meant to sort of mimic scientific publication. It has shorter articles. And I know the editor, Amy Finkelstein, is very, a proponent of some of these changes and openness. She was one of the first economists to write pre-analysis plans, et cetera. So that would be like a very natural journal to have a leadership role. And I think there's others that could easily adopt these statements. Okay, so that's one journal policy. The other journal policy is one we've heard about earlier today, which is the fact that the AEA will now do in-house verification of results before papers are even accepted for publication. That's going to be the goal. That, when papers are basically in the revision stage or conditionally accepted, data will be submitted to the data editor. It'll be verified before publication. So some people may be familiar with the top guidelines. Others may not be. The top guidelines are a set of guidelines. This is the Transparency and Openness Policy Guidelines that were issued by the Center for Open Science. Many journals have signed on to them, not many in econ. Doing in-house verification, as the AEA proposes, would actually mean the AEA journals correspond to the highest level of openness and transparency, what's called level 3. So, to really know it's computationally reproducible, a result, before it's published. So I think this is very encouraging. It's particularly encouraging given the role that the AEA has played in pushing economics towards open science traditionally. So in 2005, people may or may not be familiar with the history and the backstory. There's more on this in the book. The AEA strengthened its data sharing policy. Before 2005, in theory, authors were supposed to make their data available to other scholars, but nobody did. And that, was clear through various audit studies. In 2005, when Ben Bernanke was the lead editor of the AER, he mandated a much stricter data sharing policy that they tried to enforce. And actually, in some work Garrett and I have done, you can see that the amount of data that's shared after 2005 in AER articles just goes up very, very dramatically compared to other econ journals. So it was a pretty effective policy. Since 2005, scores of other econ journals have followed suit, and many of them have just copied the AEA policy. The AEA is the most important professional association in our field. They really set the tone. Now that the AEA is setting an even higher standard, my own prediction would be in the next few years, I would expect many other econ journals to follow suit and basically adopt policies similar to the AEA journals eventually. So I think this is an encouraging trend. Okay, so journal editorial practices could be very important. If we're involved in journals ourselves, we should think creatively about how journals can facilitate openness, can promote research transparency. And these are two particular ways. There could be many more. Okay, so that was the first thing. Journal policies are influential. Two, the rise of study registration and pre-results review is something that I want to document. I'll put some data that's pretty similar to what Kiesler showed, because she helped me generate some of it, and as did Garrett. So, conceptually, I think people are familiar with pre-registration and pre-analysis plans. There's a number of reasons why pre-registering hypotheses could have benefits. It creates a paper trail. So even if I never publish my result, the fact that there is a registration that's, public means people who are working in an area can find out about this project, even if it was a failed project, even if I didn't publish it, they can contact me, they can get my raw data. So it can definitely help with meta-analysis. The fact that there's a pre-analysis plan for a study can constrain the most extreme forms of data mining or biased reporting of results. More and more when I've been involved either as an editor or referee with papers over the last couple of years, referees, or as an author, referees really scrutinize pre-analysis plans now in a way that they didn't before. They're interested in checking it out, and they'll call out authors if there's some really gross discrepancy, like, hey, you said your primary outcome was, wages, but the only thing you reported was, something totally different. Authors will really be compelled to have some accountability to at least report some of their initial primary outcomes. Pre-analysis plans can lead to better interpretation of statistical tests. If people don't have a pre-analysis plan and they run hundreds of regressions and only report one p-value, I have no idea what that p-value means because they ran 100 regressions. If you pre-specify, I have a much better sense of what significance even means. And then an underappreciated benefit, I think, is point 4, which is when you write a pre-analysis plan, it forces you, before you even launch a project, to really carefully think through what you're doing. And I think we all think through about our projects before we do them. It isn't like we were just launching them totally, winging it. but it does lead to even more careful thinking sometimes. And having to write down your specifications can actually correct some mistakes. So these are the potential upsides. There's also been a lot of very useful discussion, including an important piece by Ben Olken in 2015 about potential costs and downsides. And, I think one of the things that we face is there are a lot of demands on researcher time, and pre-analysis plans take time. It takes time to write things up front. So there are time costs, and there could be opportunity costs. One thing that I found personally, though, in terms of time costs is even though it takes time up front to work on a pre-analysis plan, it does save some time on the back end when the data comes in. Very often, once the data comes in and you've really thought through analyses and maybe even written up code, the analysis phase can proceed faster. So there is a little bit of a substitution over time in terms of work effort. I do think overall there's a net positive time cost of writing a pre-analysis plan, but it isn't as sort of painful as it seems to be up front because it saves you some time later on. So that's one point to make. There's a lot of discussion about how long and detailed pre-analysis plans should be, and I think this is something that's still kind of an open question in economics. Should we have, very detailed plans, not very detailed plans? My own view on this is that we should be flexible. In certain types of projects, it could be valuable to have a very detailed plan where you really want to lay out your structural model or other things. In other sorts of projects, especially ones with a pretty straightforward primary outcome, a pretty straightforward design, maybe a very simple plan could work and could really add a lot of value. Yeah, maybe more detail could still be useful, but a lot of the value of the plan could come from the basics. So I think that's, something that we see. And I think, Kiesler mentioned that there's a huge, amount of variation in the length of plans. Some of that is just authors' preferences. Some of it may be related to the nature of the project. And I think we as a field should maintain openness to different types of plans. Finally, there's this issue of flexibility. Should you be able to deviate from the plan? When, from the very beginning of discussions about pre-registration and pre-analysis plans, this issue comes up. And somehow there's this notion floating around that somehow if there's a plan, all you're allowed to do is what's in the plan, that's all there is. And it's this kind of straw man that sort of floats out, is floating around. I think in every single project I've worked on, every single paper based on a pre-analysis plan I've ever seen as a referee, as an editor, my students, every single one, probably like 100 papers, people go beyond the plan. That is the norm in development economics. What we need to do is document what we did according to the plan, what is confirmatory, and then document what wasn't in the plan, and just be clear about that. What wasn't in the plan, that analysis is just as good as if you had grabbed data where there was no plan. No harm, no foul. There's no loss. But there is some extra value if I can really prove I pre-specified certain hypotheses. So I do think that this notion of flexibility is critical. Flexibility with transparency, I think, should be the goal. We can learn a ton from data that we can't foresee. And we don't want to close down paths to learning from data if we just didn't think of a hypothesis ex ante. That would be foolish as a research community. But that choice isn't there. We can have both. We really can do both. So that's one point I really want to emphasize to kind of combat the straw man of, now that we have pre-analysis plans, we're just going to be robots who write a plan and then just kind of just run that one regression and throw away our data and never look at it again. That's not how research works. Okay, so let me talk about progress in the field and the AEA registry, and Kiesler, again, totally set this up. The registry dates from 2013. There's also related registries in other fields. We heard them mentioned, the EGAP registry, which mainly features poli-sci. I should have put RIDE up here. RIDE in international development is a very large registry, actually, with more registrations than the AEA registry. I think it's 5,000 registered studies, something like that. And then in psychology, there's As Predicted and OSF. So there's a number of registries. And again, I think, in response to some of the questions, I think Kiesler gave a great answer about, where you might go in terms of different registries for different needs. OSF is the most flexible. Again, EGAP and As Predicted are more discipline specific. So this is, basically the figure that Kiesler showed before. This is data from May 2013 to May 2019, and I guess now the numbers are at 2,800 or 2,900, or maybe close to 3,000 total registration. So again, registration on the AEA site is really taking off. This isn't something that was like a temporary blip. Not only are the numbers increasing, the numbers per month are increasing. So, registration's here to stay. This is the same statistic, because again, Kiesler helped me kind of compute this. 34% have posted pre-analysis plans, with the rate rising over time. Since a number of those the registrations were post-registrations, meaning studies that had been completed before, almost certainly the share of new studies with pre-analysis plans is substantially higher than 34%. I'm not sure exactly what it is, if it's 50 or 45 or whatever it is, but a very large share of, if not a majority of new registrations have pre-analysis plans. So again, norms are changing. 5 years ago, no one knew what a pre-analysis plan was. And now it's very normal in economics, and I think especially in development economics, to have a pre-analysis plan. So there's been a lot of change. What is the effect of having this registration? I think this is one of the things we're interested in, and it ties into this broader question of trying to find solutions to problems. So for instance, will it be the case that now that we have registration, we're going to see more null results, that we're actually going to have null results published, that unexpected or null results won't just disappear? I mean, that would be a wonderful consequence of having a registry. We don't know the answer to that yet. The registry is new. We're still trying to figure that out. There isn't maybe the perfect research design to figure that out, but I think that's one of the things we should be interested in. In addition to the analysis Kiesler did, there's also some ongoing work by George Ofosu and Dan Posner at UCLA along these lines, where they're basically grabbing getting pre-analysis plans from authors, comparing them to published papers, comparing them to the registry, and just trying to figure out how pre-registration and pre-analysis plans are working. And they're doing it in econ and poli-sci. They come from poli-sci. So I think there's still a lot more we can learn. But even though we can't sort of conclude anything yet about economics, we can learn from other fields. So a lot of the rise in RCTs, in registration, in other developments in the social sciences was very explicitly inspired by medicine. And again, I remember this from the early days of experiments in economics, where we said, hey, medical trials happen. Why can't we do economic trials? Like, it was a very explicit thing. Same thing for the registry. So the registration in economics and pre-analysis plans were inspired by clinicaltrials.gov, which existed starting in 2000, which is a huge registry with, I think hundreds of thousands of studies registered. So what can we learn from medicine? They've had a much longer time frame. One of the things that having a registry has enabled them to do is figure out how often published papers deviate from plans and registries. That's the Mathieu et al. Paper. So there is some deviation that's documented, although, of course, a nice thing about the registry is now we can quantify that. Before, we couldn't even quantify it. So even if there's some deviation, we're learning, there's some accountability. Beyond that, there's a relatively recent paper by Kaplan and Irvin, which suggests that the existence of a registry can actually help us see more null results. So let me show you their main figure. So this is data from a number, several dozen trials funded by NIH, all on nutritional and dietary supplements. They were all funded, pretty high quality studies funded by NIH through the same funding mechanism, before and after 2000. So again, not the perfect research design. Other things may have changed in 2000. There could have been other trends in the field. But what you can see is a very clear pattern that's at least consistent with the registry having beneficial impacts for the field as a whole. If you look before 2000, those pluses are significant results, statistically significant results. And the magnitude, the farther away you are from the horizontal gray shaded area, the larger the effect. This is like relative risk, from 0 to 1. So you can see big reductions in various problems for people treated with various dietary and nutritional supplements. Huge reductions, 50% reductions, 40% reductions, lots of significant results. Relatively few null results, the blue circles, before 2000. After 2000, you see the vast majority of null results. You basically see a clustering of results around 0. And a few significant results, some positive, some negative. I mean, one way of viewing the post period is it's all 0, and there were a couple noisy studies maybe with some positives and negatives. But again, this is very consistent with a reduction in publication bias after the registry was implemented. So I think this should be inspiration for us in economics and political science and other social sciences, that maybe we really are doing the right thing. Maybe we really will see some more null results and get a less biased take of the research literature now that we're registering studies. Okay, so the third bit of the rise in study registration and pre-results review has to do with registered reports or pre-results review. So in other fields in the last few years, there's been a rise of pre-results review, meaning reviewing a paper where, let's say, the end-line data hasn't been collected yet. And, you know, when I've raised this with economists or we've talked about it, people's initial reaction is often like, wait, how can you do that? How can you judge a paper when there's no results? That's really weird. And I think there's a few responses to that. One is, we actually do this all the time. If you serve on a grant review panel, whether it's an NSF panel, an NIH panel, grad student travel grant panel, we're making assessments about the likely quality, importance, impact of research based on the design, the data, but no results. We do this all the time. So we can evaluate research without seeing the results. And of course, the advantage of pre-results review is then we don't get into this trap of null results being impossible or hard to publish, or maybe unexpected results being hard to publish. Going back, I alluded before to the minimum wage studies of Card and Kruger. They found there was a lot of resistance to their initial results. Their initial results showed that when you raise the minimum wage, there's either no effect on employment or even positive effects on employment, like the wrong sign compared to neoclassical economics. Now, there's actually been the development of quite a bit of theory in the last 20 years suggesting that maybe this isn't a crazy finding at all. But at the time, it was the wrong sign. So it was hard to publish. It was rejected. I would sort of throw out there that unexpected results from well-designed studies should be some of the most important studies to publish. They may actually tell us our theory is wrong. So, you know, economics has a tradition of only wanting to publish results that affirm neoclassical economic theory. That doesn't seem very scientific, right? Aren't we supposed to test theory? So, again, pre-results review is meant to make the process more scientific. If you have a well-designed study with good data and you get an unexpected finding, that's exciting. That gives us something to learn. Okay, so what's the state of play on pre-results review? Well, these other journals, mainly in psychology, have developed a sort of system for pre-results review. And as Katie mentioned, the JDE, Journal of Development Economics, has adopted it. So let me give you a sense of the idealized pipeline. We've had to do some modification of this just because the nature of publication is a little different in econ, and Alex Bogdanovsky worked on those frequently asked questions and guidelines. There's basically two stages of review. With pre-results review. What authors do is they initially write what's called a proposal. It's sort of like a glorified pre-analysis plan, laying out, here are my outcomes, here's my question, here are my outcomes, here's my analysis, here are the hypotheses I'm testing. So, it's sort of like an extended pre-analysis plan. That is sent to the journal for review, and referees review it and try to get a sense of, is this a worthwhile piece of science without knowing the results? At that point, there could be an R&R, revise and resubmit process with the journal, if the editor and the referees want the authors to clarify some details. But if they are able to clarify them, then the paper receives what's called in-principle acceptance. It's like a conditional acceptance in a journal. So the paper is not yet officially accepted, but the journal commits to publishing it as long as when the authors get their end-line data in, they do the analysis they said they were going to do, and they interpret it in a reasonable way. That's the idea. Now, it's not a guarantee of publication because I may never get the end-line data. There could be a civil war in South Sudan, like Elliot's project, which means I don't get end-line data and I can't write that paper. I could have a problem. There could be turnover in the government of Mexico and they could scrap anti-poverty program, and on and on. We all know the kind of contingencies in development economics, but if the data comes in, it's good quality, and it's interpreted reasonably, the paper is going to get published. So then the stage 2 part is people send in the final paper, and, in theory, maybe there's a very brief kind of revision or R&R process before the paper gets accepted. So there's a little more kind of weight here in the review process because there's 2 stages, but it's not that different from what we do already. And I think, Alex did some interviews with referees and authors, and I think so far they found the process to be pretty natural for people who are used to the journal publication process. And for anybody who's gone through like 3 or 4 rounds of R&Rs, this doesn't look so bad, right? I mean, it kind of looks familiar. Okay, so look at the left-hand panel here. The vertical axis is the number of journals across fields that have adopted the registered reports framework or pre-results review. You can see there's tons in psychology, there's some in medicine, really just in the last couple years. So this was like an article format that 5 or 6 years ago was basically unknown, that has really taken off in some fields. And I think this was the inspiration. I don't think we ever would have been able to convince the editors of the Journal of Development Economics to try this out if we weren't able to point to successes in other fields and say, like, wow, there's like 50 journals in psychology doing this now. Like, this is a totally normal review process. It's not something radical or risky. So again, people have sometimes asked and said, oh, this is strange. How are we going to do pre-results review? There is actually a very interesting precedent in economics that I think has mainly been forgotten, but we do mention it in the book, and I'm mentioning it here and trying to, remind people of. There was an example of a pre-analysis plan and pre-results review around 20 years ago in economics in the context of these very contentious debates over the minimum wage in the U.S. So at the time, Card and Kruger had their results, and David Newmark and other labor economists had different results showing, minimum wage increases led to reductions in employment, and there was a lot of back and forth and disagreement. And according to my colleague at Berkeley, David Levine, who was the editor of the journal Industrial Relations at the time, the late, great Alan Kruger had the idea, why don't Card and Kruger and Newmark and co-authors get together and just agree on the right specifications? And this was in 1996 when the federal minimum wage was being increased, and there were going to be releases of data in the coming year that they could test. They could basically test their hypotheses on that data. So the data hadn't been released. The minimum wage, the natural experiment was ongoing. So it was really pre-specified. Now, at the end of the day, Card and Kruger actually did not participate in this. They didn't collaborate with Newmark, but Newmark ended up writing a pre-analysis plan, sending it to David Levine, the editor, who clarified a few things and gave it the equivalent of in-principle acceptance. And then once the data, so this was in 1996, Newmark writes his plan, the data become available, Newmark analyzes it, and eventually it gets published in the journal. And actually, David Levine wrote up a kind of editorial statement in Industrial Relations describing the process. So there is a kind of an intellectual history. I'll sort of name drop one more famous researcher. David Levine credits Danny Kahneman for kind of like even like a deeper inspiration for this idea. Danny Kahneman had previously in the 80s and 90s in his research, when he had disagreement with psychologists, would reach out to them and do what he called, Danny Kahneman, I think, coined this term, adversarial collaboration. Say, look, we're in different labs, we disagree, let's get together and run experiments together. Experiments we all agree are the right tests. So David Levine had heard about this from Danny Kahneman, who did his research most of his career at Berkeley at that time. And in conversations between Danny Kahneman and David Levine and then Alan Kruger, like this idea came out. So there is actually a precedent in economics for this kind of work. So we're not totally on new terrain here. So how did it work at the JDE when we tried to implement this? We were very lucky to get a lot of support from Andy Foster and Dean Carlin, who are editors at the JDE. They were excited about this process. Maybe they were a little skeptical at first, but I think that's where the experience of other fields helped and all the support from BITS, in particular Alex. So it was launched last year, and in the first year of this pilot to allow for pre-results review in economics, we didn't even know if there'd be any submissions. Like, would anybody care to do this? In the first year, there were 46 of these first stage proposals submitted. Actually, now it's over 50, I just found out, because there's been more just in the last few weeks. So it's about like one a week, and it's been accelerating. I think the first few months it was slow, and then it's been accelerating over time. 5 have already received in-principle acceptance, and I know at least some of them are already coming back with stage 2 review right now. So there could be papers that are forthcoming very soon that went through this process. And again, in interviews with authors and referees, there weren't really red flags. People found the process natural. And I think, again, the JDE was the right journal to do it in because so many development economists already write pre-analysis plans. It's become so normal that once you're already writing and registering a pre-analysis plan, it's only a couple steps further to submit a proposal to the JDE. JDE recently made this a permanent track. Now you're just going to be able to submit pre-results review. It's not going to be a pilot. Experimental Economics is launching a pilot. Other journal editors have reached out to BITS So we'll see where it goes going forward. But again, I think there's a lot of promise here, not to sort of replace other article formats, but for certain types of papers, this could be the right track. One of the things that's definitely come through in the interviews is a lot of more junior scholars who are going up for tenure, who are looking to get promoted, looking to get a job, find it very useful, this track, because they can get an in-principle acceptance from a really good field journal even before their end-line data is collected. So it really compresses the whole project, the whole process of review, and gets prestigious line items on people's CVs. You know, this is in their own self-interest, a year earlier or 2 years earlier than might have been the case. So I think hopefully junior scholars can benefit going forward. Okay, last bit, I have 5 minutes left. I just want to mention something about trends in open science and research transparency. This is results from a new working paper with co-authors at Berkeley, the Census Bureau, Garrett, Princeton, and MIT, so kind of a group across institutions of economists and psychologists. So this is a interdisciplinary collaboration. We ran a survey last year in 2018 of scholars in the 4 largest social science fields in terms of faculty and student enrollments: econ, poli-sci, psychology, and sociology. We reached out to scholars who had published in the top 10 most cited journals in those fields between 2014 and 2016, and graduate students in the top 20 ranked North American departments, partially just for logistical convenience across these fields. We incentivized folks to respond to our survey. Some faculty received up to $80 as an incentive for a 15-minute survey. Now, in retrospect, we kind of thought maybe that was too high. Like, people were like, oh, this is a scam. We're like, no, we're really going to pay you that amount of money. So those who trusted us benefited. But I think it's very hard to get people to respond to email surveys. We're very happy that we got a response rate close to 50%. And I think, again, $60 or $80 for a 15-minute survey is maybe the upper limit of what you can afford in most surveys. So maybe this is the upper limit in survey response rate, unless we incentivize too high and we got this sort of lack of trust scam backlash. We're not sure. But we have 50%, basically a 50% response rate. It's not perfect. I'll talk a little bit about limitations, but we've got a good chunk of the research active population here. What do we find when we survey these folks? We find there's a really rapid rise in really multiple dimensions of open science practices. So this is some of the data. This is the raw data from the survey. Here we restrict attention to scholars who had their PhDs at least since 2007, so who are basically research active starting at least in 2005. And the different lines denote different practices. The green line is what fraction of folks had posted data and when did they start doing so. So if you go back to 2005, just when the AER was like beginning to have a data sharing policy, very few people had posted data by that point. But over time, it rises to a pretty high share. So at this point, 73% of the research active scholars that we surveyed had posted data. 44% had posted study instruments. In terms of pre-registration, you see, again, it was like unknown until a few years ago, and there's this pretty steep increase. In terms of what the shading is, what we did is for the roughly half of respondents who didn't answer our survey, we did some validation. We basically audited. We went to the AEA registry and searched for their name. We went on Dataverse. We did other things to sort of audit their behavior. And we found that the non-respondents had somewhat lower adoption of these practices than respondents based on a quick search. Maybe this is a lower bound on what they had really done. So the shading kind of gives the range of outcomes, taking into account non-response. You can see the same patterns, maybe slightly lower level, but definitely a sharp upward trend. This is the breakdown by field. I just have 2 more slides and I'll wrap up. Economics and poli-sci look very similar. Psychology was really a laggard until recently with very sharp increases in recent years, especially in pre-registration. Sociology is really the laggard though. And then this is the last slide of data. There's a very sharp breakdown by the type of work people do. And I think this was striking for us. Folks who predominantly do experimental work are basically fast adopters of all of these practices. Folks who do observational work, the middle panel, but non-experimental work, share their data just like experimentalists do, but they don't really pre-register because they may not have the means to do so if they're using secondary data. People who do theoretical or qualitative work don't adopt as many of these open science practices. And that can probably explain differences across field. Okay, so this is just to wrap up. We also surveyed folks on their attitudes. There's a nice summary stat for people in this room. When we asked development economists in our data if they were supportive of pre-registration, 80% were supportive. When we asked them how many other development economists they thought were supportive, it was like 40 to 50%. So we felt like we were there's a couple of interpretations of that. I can't rule out different biases, non-representativeness of the sample, et cetera. But one possibility is we're in the middle of a scientific change, a change in norms. People are supportive, norms are changing, adoption is rising, but people are still thinking back to a few years ago when we asked them about the attitudes of the rest of the field. So let me just wrap up there and take questions. I really feel like change is possible. Progress is being made. You know, you saw lots of upward sloping curves in this presentation. It's a very exciting time to be doing what we're doing. And I really hope this meeting can just lead to more collaboration and progress by all of us working together. So thank you.
A couple of minutes for questions, but you're going to be here all afternoon?
Yeah, I'll be around all afternoon.
So also, you know, we can carry discussion through in the discussion rounds this afternoon. We have quite a lot of time for that, as you may have noticed this morning.
This was really motivational and inspirational talk. Thank you so much for sharing all this data with us. It's great to see. Oh, I'm Morgan Holmes from 3IE. Sorry. One thing that this presentation made me think of is, you're familiar with the Mediketa initiative of EGAP. I had never thought of it this way before. You know, it answers the question of generalizability and external validity. But do you think that sort of model could also answer the question of more pre-analysis plans? And are other disciplines doing anything like that?
I love the Mediketa initiative. For people who aren't familiar with it, this was a coordinated set of experiments. I think there were 6 experiments in political science or 7 experiments in political science answering a related question. It was related to political accountability, the way they set it up. But the methodology could be applied beyond that. 7 studies with a coordinated research question, at least one coordinated treatment arm, but then they had sort of additional treatment arms that went in different directions. But that allowed them to pool data across all these different settings that they had chosen ex ante. I think it could be a model for other work. I don't see any reason why we couldn't do something similar if we could get the researchers on board to buy in. I think that was one of the challenges they found, or in general, researchers want to do their thing and sort of trying to, they feel like they're being forced or shoehorned into a project, that could be a negative. But we see this in medical research all the time. There's basically multi-site clinical trials where they'll say, hey, we want to look across a diversity of populations. NIH is going to fund 5 major sites for a clinical trial. So I think Mediketa, again, is on sort of firm ground methodologically, and I'd love to see more work like that in economics, for sure. Yeah.
One more now.
So just one footnote I'd like to add. I thought the historical perspective was useful, but I think we should probably also recognize that pre-analysis plans probably go back a lot farther than 1996. They just get called something different. So the U.S. government has been funding RCTs for 50 years on things like negative income tax experiment or other sort of social innovations, but they usually mandate a design report. And these design reports sort of serve as a record. They're actually pretty, as having done several of them, sort of an onerous deliverable, but they serve this function of documenting the planned analysis. Yeah. And they go through fairly rigorous review before the research can proceed. I wonder if maybe we just need to get those more into public record than they currently are.
Yeah, that's a great point. And again, even less formally than that, folks think through their research designs ex ante. There's IRBs, there's grant proposals. There's sort of content on research plans in a lot of places. I think what's so nice about the registry is that it is public, and at least for basic registration, there's standard fields, which is really good in terms of creating metadata and for meta-analysis. So I do think that the point you raised at the end about putting these in the public domain and maybe putting them in a common format is the innovation, because people were always thinking through their plans ex ante. Yeah, I agree with that.
One last question is, I am curious if you see any movement towards more transparency or kind of pre-analysis discussion about actual data collection. It seems, from what we've sort of experienced within DIME, there's a lot of focus in the beginning of the process and on, the research design and increasingly on pre-analysis plans, but very little actually on how the data that you'll use is getting collected and attention being focused on kind of the quality controls around that process or standardization or anything there. I'm just curious if you see it.
Yeah, that's such a great question. I do think that, there is more sharing of survey instruments than there used to be, which is a step in that direction, but only to the extent that it's well documented. So you could imagine a very well documented data set with the raw survey instruments, with lots of field documentation, could get somewhere, to where you want to be in terms of data quality. But very often we don't know. We grab data from the web, or there's something posted, which is just the analysis data with very little information on collection. So that would be another direction to push things. If the data is bad quality and we don't know where it's coming from, maybe all the rest of this is useless. So yeah, I would agree with that. But hopefully posting of surveys and documentation is at least a first step in that direction.